بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Until now, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah was explaining the different levels of Sahih narrations, and he used Asahul Asanid, that he showed the huge difference between those narrations which scholars regarded as the most authentic of all asanid compared to those which just made it to be sahih. That Zameen Asman Kifark, there's such a huge difference. And then he showed the disparity even more when you compare those which are on the highest level of sahih compared to those which are only hasan. So now he mentions here that ويلتحق بهذا التفاضل ما اتفق الشيخان على تخريجه بالنسبة إلى من فرد به أحدهما ومن فرد به البخاري بالنسبة إلى من فرد به مسلم لاتفاق العلماء بعدهما على تلقي كتابيهما بالقبول واختلاف بعضهم في أيما أرجح فما اتفقا عليه أرجح من هذه الحيثية مما لم يتفقا عليه. So until now, all this that he was explaining on Asahul Asanid, they are all with regards to the Sanad. So now he's explaining, remember here again, keep in mind that his point is to show you the different levels of Sahih, to show you that not all Sahih Ahadith are of one level, there are different levels. So he's explaining it now from a completely different angle. And he claims here that the different stages of Sahih narrations can be understood from the books in which those narrations are narrated in. So he's saying that those narrations which Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah have narrated, they are preferred over those narrations which only one of them narrated. And then those narrations which only Imam Bukhari narrated are preferred over those narrations which Imam Muslim rahimahullah has narrated. So here in the footnotes you can see Sheikh Nuruddin Itr rahimahullah, he says that هذا تفضيل بحسب المرجع الذي خرج الحديث أما التفضيل السابق فهو بحسب قوة الإسناد والتفضيل بحسب قوة الإسناد أعلى ولا شك. That his previous example which he has given to show you the differences in Sahih narrations, that was more clear and it was more stronger. Nevertheless, here Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is looking at the fact that there are some authors like Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah who made it a point to mention only authentic narrations. So firstly, obviously, Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, you know what great experts they were. Then they were very cautious regarding which narrations they added in their books. So couple the immense knowledge which they had with this caution which they are now taking and how they are selecting which narrations to put in these books. So in these books they took it upon themselves that here they are only going to mention those narrations which are the most authentic. So therefore narrations in these books, according to what Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is saying here, they will enjoy additional preference over narrations which are mentioned in other books. For example, a narration which comes in Abu Dawud or which Imam Tirmidhi rahimahumullah narrated. So just like you know how there for Asahul Asanid, you had the earlier scholars, Ishaq bin Rahuya, Imam Ahmad rahimahumullah, Ali bin Madini rahimahullah, etc. They were saying Asahul Asanid. So this was what the earlier scholars done, and then the later day scholars refuted it. So in the same way here, we find that some later day scholars, they assume that there will be additional merit just because a certain author narrated a particular hadith in a book which was meant for only authentic narrations. So here now Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is actually going to mention 7 categories, but in this paragraph, as you can see, he mentioned 3 categories. Those narrations which Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim narrated, then only those narrations which Imam Bukhari narrated, then only those narrations which Imam Muslim rahimahullah has narrated. So here he only mentioned 3 and then he digresses. And what does he digress to? He now discusses his reasoning that why is Bukhari given preference over Sahih Muslim. Then only 2 pages later, so in our print on page 64, he continues with the remaining 4, because we said it's in 7 categories. So here he mentions 3 categories, then he digresses in explaining how he made those 3 categories, or rather not how he made it. He explains how those 3 categories are used, and then after 2 pages, he explains the remaining 4 categories. But for us here, it's better for us to go through all 7 categories, because that's the main thing which Ibn Hajar rahmallah is trying to prove. So we first see what his primary objective is, and then after that, all these things which he mentioned on the side, we can discuss them separately. So to go through these 7 categories, he's saying that, and these are what are known as Taqsīm as-Sab'ī. Some have called it Taqsīm as-Subā'ī. So if you see in other books written Taqsīm as-Sab'ī, then you know they are talking about these 7 categories. So what are these 7 categories? These 7 categories mean, the first category is that those narrations which both Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah have narrated in their Sahihs, they will be the most authentic of all narrations according to these scholars. So the narrations which Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah both narrated, that's the first category. Then slightly more inferior to that are those narrations which only Imam Bukhari rahimahumullah is narrated, not Imam Muslim rahimahullah. That's the second category. Then the third category are those narrations which only Imam Muslim rahimahullah is narrated, Imam Bukhari rahimahullah is not narrated. So until here, it revolves around the 3 books. Now the fourth category, and we will explain later when we come to the text of Ibn Hajar, that he first expressed some doubt on whether this indeed will be the fourth category or not. But we'll explain that in the text. So the fourth category are those narrations which were not narrated by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah, but they fulfill the conditions of Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah. That means it could be fine for Imam Bukhari to narrate such a hadith. It fulfills all the conditions of Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah. So that's the fourth category. The fifth category are those narrations which were not narrated by Imam Bukhari rahimahullah or and Imam Muslim, but it at least fulfills the conditions of only Imam Bukhari rahimahullah. Then the sixth category are those narrations which are not narrated by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, but it at least fulfill the conditions of Imam Muslims. So we're already on the sixth category, and you can see it's still revolving only around Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah. So then the seventh category are those narrations which are narrated in other books. So you can see here from the 7 categories that 6 of them are only revolving around those 2 kitabs, and then the 7th is revolving around all the other thousands of kitabs which were written after that. So here Ibn Hajar rahmallah is asserting that there is just like how when you look through Asahul Asanid, and then you look at those narrations which are Hasan, you can see the huge differences. So he's trying to say that, look, those which are in the first category, which Imam Bukhari rahimahumullah and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah have narrated, they will be much more authentic than those narrations which are in this last category, in the 7th category. For example, a narration which is authentic, but Imam Ibn Majah rahimahullah, for example, has narrated. So in that way, it's very clear that there is a difference between the different categories of Sahih narrations. That's the point which he is trying to prove. Now, here to go back to these 7 categories, that Ibn Hajar is mentioning these 7 categories here. From where does he get these 7 categories? Who made up these 7 categories? So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is actually getting these 7 categories from Ibn Salah rahimahullah. Now you know Ibn Salah rahimahullah, he was dictating his kitab, his Ulum al-Hadith Muqaddama Ibn Salah, between the year 631 to 634 Hijri. So that's important to keep in mind, the year in which he was writing or dictating his kitab. So there, if you got the print of Sheikh Nuruddin Itr, then on page 27, he mentions as the 7th fa'idah of Sahih narrations, that وإذا انتهى الأمر في معرفة الصحيح إلى ما خرجه الأئمة في تصانيفهم الكافلة ببيان ذلك كما سبق ذكره فالحاجة ماسة إلى التنبيه على أقسام باعتبار ذلك. And then he mentions the 7 aqsam. After mentioning the 7 aqsam, then he says هذه أمهات أقسامه, and then he says وأعلاها الأول, that the highest is the first. So Ibn Salah mentions it in his Muqaddamah. But before him, if you have to look, you will find that he actually took these from Al-Imam Mayanishi rahmahullah. Now, if you remember in the introduction of this kitab, in the beginning of this kitab, we were discussing the books before Ibn Hajar rahmahullah. Then he mentioned there that وأبو حفص المياني جزءا سماه ما لا يسع المحدث جهله, and we have discussed what Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah has commented on it, etc. Nevertheless, in that very book ما لا يسع المحدث جهله, Mayanishi, he mentioned, but there he only mentioned 4 categories. So it seems like Ibn Salah rahmallah got these 7 categories from him. So what does Alama Mayanishi mention? He in the 4 categories, he says as-Sahīḥu min ahādīth Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam ala maratib asahhuha wa a'laha. So look, the first category is mentioning, it's the same like what Ibn Salah mentions. Mattafaqa ala takhrijī al-Shaykhan al-Bukhari wa Muslim fi sahīḥayhima radiyallahu anhuma. That's the first category, so that's fine. But then the second category he mentions وَيَتْلُوهُ مَنْ فَرَدَ بِهِ كُلُّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا. So Ibn Salah, as you can see, that he is making the second category only those narrations which Imam Bukhari rahimahullah has narrated alone. Then he's putting a third category for those which Imam Muslim rahimahullah has narrated. Al-Imam Yanishi is mentioning both in the second category وَيَتْلُوهُ مَنْ فَرَدَ بِهِ كُلُّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا. Then the third category which Al-Imam Yanishi is making is وَيَتْلُوهُ مَا كَانَ عَلَى شَرْطِهِمَا وَإِن لَمْ يُخَرِّجَاهُ فِي صَحِيحَيْهِمَا لِعِلَّةٍ وَقَعَتْ لَهُمَا. So those which fulfill the conditions which they have not mentioned. And that's what Ibn Salah put as the 4th category. Al-Imam Yanishi mentioned as the 3rd category. Then as the 4th category, Al-Imam Yanishi mentions something completely different to what Ibn Salah rahmallah mentioned. He said, ثُمَّ دُونَ ذَلِكَ فِي الصِّحَّةِ مَا كَانَ إِسْنَادُهُ حَسَنًا. So this here is in مَا لَا يَسْعُ الْمُحَدِّث جَهْلُهُ, and we use the kitab which is printed in the Khams al-Rasail of Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda. So there it is on page 262. So he says, in mentioning Sahih narrations, he put it like this into 4 categories. But as you can see, the 4th category is with regards to Hasan narrations. Therefore, it's only the first 3 which deals with Sahih narrations. So Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda then he comments on in the footnotes, and he says, هذا التقسيم للحديث الصحيح الذي ذكر الميانشي لم أره لمن قبله ولعله أول من قاله. He says that this taqsīm which Al-Imam Yanishi is mentioning, he's saying that I haven't found anyone else before him mentioning it. So وَلَعَلَّهُ أَوَّلُ مَنْ قَالَهُ, it seems as if he is the first. Then there was a contemporary of his, someone who passed away just a few years after him, Allama Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah. So in his kitab on Mawdu'at, al-Mawdu'at min al-Ahadith al-Marfu'at, there he presented 6 categories. So Al-Imam Yanishi, he gave 4 categories, and someone who passed away just a little bit after him, he mentioned 6 categories. So how did Allama Ibn al-Jawzi rahmallah divide them? He mentions them, let us say, that he brings a chapter. You say, which is better, Mullah Alik's book on Mawdu'at or Ibn al-Jawzi's? So it depends. For Ibn al-Jawzi rahmallah, there are a lot of ta'aqqubat on it, and you know there's so much. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, he wrote al-Munar al-Munif. There are many ta'aqqubat, so his book is beneficial. But if you haven't studied takhrij, then you will find him, if you just open his book, and you are going to see him mentioning a hadith which is mawdu', whereas others would not only narrate it, mention that it's not mawdu', they would even bring it to the status of a Hasan narration. So therefore, on that basis, you can give preference to the book of Mullah al-Qari. But if you did do takhrij, then Ibn al-Jawzi, and you do understand, and you don't just blindly follow, you're not just opening it as a book, then obviously Ibn al-Jawzi's book would be more beneficial. So here he's mentioning that the first category is متفق على صحته or متفق على صحته. So that is the first, the exact same like what Ibn Salah rahmallah is mentioned and what Al-Imam Yanishi is mentioned. Then after that he goes on and explains in 2 pages a whole lot of other things. And then the second category is man farada bihi al-Bukhari or Muslim. So you can see, just like Al-Imam Mayani, she is putting the second and third category of Ibn Salah into one category. And it says, Man farada bil Bukhari or Muslim. Whereas Ibn Salah rahmallah and Ibn Hajar rahmallah, as you can see, they are putting it into two separate categories. Then the third category is ما صح سنده على رأي أحد الشيخين. He's saying that the sanad would be authentic according to the opinion of Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, because it fulfills their conditions. Then the fourth category, and then here there's ta'aqqubat on him, because he's mentioning that ما فيه ضعف قريب محتمل وهذا هو الحسن ويصلح البناء عليه والعمل به. But then after mentioning this here, he says وقد كان أحمد بن حنبل يقدم الحديث الضعيف على القياس. So he's mentioning that it is those which narrations which have a little bit of weakness in them, and because of that they become Hasan. There are no more authentic narrations. And then he brings this and he says Imam Ahmad would prefer da'if narrations. So he's trying to say that these kind of Hasan narrations, they are closer to being da'if rather than being closer to being sahih, because that is why he brings this. And from there then he goes on to the fifth category, and shadid al-du'af al-kathir al-tazalzul. So you can see that shadid al-du'af means close to being mawdu'. So this is how he divided it. Obviously there's ta'aqqub on it, because he's not showing those which are hasan lidati, those which are hasan but closer towards being sahih. He's not even showing those which are just a little bit weak, etc. But nevertheless, this is how the two scholars mentioned it. So you have Al-Imam Mayanishi mentioning it, and from them you have Ibn al-Jawzi. So Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah says that وَلَعَلَّهُ وَقَفَ عَلَى تَقْسِيمِ الْمَيَانِشِ وَبَنَى عَلَيْهِ. That it's probable that Ibn al-Jawzi, he found that Al-Imam Mayanishi mentioned it. So Al-Imam Mayanishi, so to say, invented this whole thing. He came out with it. He brought it up. He's the first to mention it. Then Ibn al-Jawzi rahmallah came and he modified it a little bit. وَلَمَّا جَاءَ ابْنُ صَلَاحَ جَعَلَ التَّقْسِيمِ لِلْحَدِيثِ سُبَاعِيًا. Then when Allama ibn Salah rahmallah came, then he refined it and mentioned it like this here into 7 categories by taking the second category of Allama Mayanishi and Ibn al-Jawzi and making it into 2 categories, and then taking the third category of Ibn al-Jawzi and making it into 3 categories, the fourth, fifth and sixth category. So in this way, Ibn al-Jawzi rahmallah, Ibn Salah rahmallah is the one who innovated it. But what we learn from all of this here is that the whole idea of these categories were only initiated by someone who passed away close to the end of the 6th century. Because Allama Mayanishi passed away in the year 583. So scholars before him, they knew nothing about it, and they would not divide a hadith at all like this here. And then this actual 7 categories which Ibn Hajar rahmallah is mentioning here, it's only now mentioned by Ibn Salah in midway the next century. So because Ibn Salah, one is when he gave his durus, and then he passed away in the year 643. So you can already see from here how weak this opinion and these categories are all going to be. Because it's from Ibn Salah rahmallah that actually it became so famous. From Ibn Salah, then Imam, all those who wrote commentaries on Muqaddamah Ibn Salah and all those who worked on the kitab, they then began to spread it. And you know, there were so many. فَلَا يُحْصَى كَمْ نَاظِمٍ لَهُ وَمُخْتَصِرٍ وَمُخْتَدِرٍ عَلَيْهِ وَمُقْتَصِرٍ وَمُعَارِضٍ لَهُ وَمُنْتَصِرٍ. I'm sure you know whose statement it is, and where that statement which I just quoted now is mentioned. So it's only from Ibn Salah rahmallah that these 7 categories became popular. Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah, he says, وَانْتَشَرَ تَقْسِيمُ ابْنِ الصَّلَاحِ من طريقه في الكتب وأخذ مأخذ القول وأخذ مأخذ القبول والإقرار. So scholars before Ibn Salah rahmallah, they would not divide a hadith like this here at all. Then in a footnote of Tawjih an-Naḍar on page 290, Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahmallah, he mentions there that وهذا الترتيب في الأصحية ترتيب قام على أسلوب المناطق وتقسيماتهم ولم يقم على أسلوب المحدثين وواقع الحال. He's saying that this categorizing a hadith like this here, it's based on how philosophers would divide things. Muhaddithun, they would not divide a hadith like this here. And then he mentions a very important statement which actually becomes evidence to show that this entire division is baseless. He says إذ واقع الوجود يخالفه والنظر العلمي لا يتقبله. That no one can apply these 7 categories fully. Because if a person is going to try to apply these 7 categories fully and first give preference only to those narrations which Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim narrate, then only those narrations of Imam Bukhari, it's going to mean that he will become a muqallid of Imam Bukhari. It means he can't be a Hanafi, he can't be a Shafi, a Maliki, or Hanbali. He'll be a muqallid of Imam Bukhari. But then it would be difficult for him because Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, their objective was not to make isti'ab and to gather all sahih narrations and to actually write a complete manual on fiqh. That was not their objective. So therefore, there's going to be so many sections in fiqh where you're not going to know what's happening. And that is why when you look at a Hanafi school or the Shafi'i school, it's not just the work of one person, it's a whole school of thought. So therefore, it's impossible for someone to follow all of these. Because if you really want to assume that Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, rahimahumullah, have all the most authentic ahadith, then logically looking at it, it would mean that all those narrations which are muttafaq alayh, they all have to be narrated with asahul asanid. Because only then it could be the most authentic of all narrations. Because just now, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah himself said that those narrations from Ar-Rutbatil Ulya, they are the most highest category. So if they are the most highest category, then if you are looking in the books, then it would mean that Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah together would have to narrate all of those narrations. And that's how, on that basis, then you can say that those narrations which are muttafaq alayh. In fact, taking it a step further, you would have to say that Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, when they made ittifaq on a hadith, then they only made ittifaq on those type of narrations which are mutawatir. So obviously that is not the case. Because even if you have to look, Imam Bukhari rahmallah, his objective was not to mention the most authentic of all sanads. Because even from those teachers of his who were the most, who he held in the most esteem, he would not narrate a lot from them. For example, Imam Bukhari only narrates once from Imam Ahmad rahmallah, but he quotes him. So he quotes him showing that he's an authority. That's why he can quote him, that if he takes Imam Ahmad's name, so he acknowledges the sublime status of Imam Ahmad rahmallah, but he hardly narrates from him. Likewise, Imam Muslim does not narrate at all from Imam Bukhari rahmallah. But you know in what esteem he held Imam Bukhari. Yeah, it's granted that he only met Imam Bukhari after he completed writing his Sahih, and that is one reason why he did not narrate from Imam Bukhari. But obviously he still lived so many years after that. So if he wanted to, he could edit it and he could narrate from Imam Bukhari rahmallah, because if his focus is to mention asahhu sihah, then he would have done that. But the proof that that was not his objective. So therefore, you will find that many scholars rejected these 7 categories and they disapproved of it. Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, in his footnotes of Ma La Yasa'u al-Muhaddis Jahlu, he says, وَكُلُّ هَذِهِ التَّقَاسِيمِ لَا يَخْلُو عَنِ انْتِقَادٍ وَنَقْضٍ. That all of these years, there's much criticism on it. Firstly, the greatest thing is that it was so late. It came about only to close to the at the end of the 6th century, and then moving on to the 7th century. So that alone shows you how weak it is. Then scholars then also say that it's not practical. Allama Qasim bin Kutlubugha, he spoke against these 7 categories in his Qawlul Mubtakar when commenting on the 4th category. He said, الذي يقتضيه النظر أن ما كان على شرطهما وليس له علة مقدم على ما أخرجه مسلم وحده لأن قوة الحديث إنما هي بالنظر إلى رجاله لا بالنظر إلى كونه في كتاب كذا. So he mentions this here. It all goes back to looking at the sanad, not looking at which kitab it comes from. Likewise, Allama Ibn Humam rahmallah, he also spoke about it and he called these 7 categories tahakkum, and he said لا يجوز التقليد به, that you cannot follow these 7 categories. إذا الأصحية ليس إلا لاشتمال رواتهما على الشروط التي اعتبروها. And then, so he's proving that you cannot just grade a narration which comes in these kitabs in Bukhari and Imam Muslim, in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim as the most authentic, because you have to look at the shurut which they have placed and how they would have accepted. So therefore he's calling it Aynut Tahakkum, and he's calling it like, to translate it in English, he's calling it absolute foolishness. That's the best way to translate it. So that's here he mentions in Fath al-Qadir, on page 317 of volume 1. So Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda also gives a few names of other scholars who spoke against these in his footnotes of Tawjih an-Naḍar between page 291 and 292. But that's a few names which he mentions. Besides that, in practically applying it, you will find that no one ever, whether it's Ibn Salah rahmallah who came up with these 7 categories, or whether it's Ibn Hajar rahmallah who's accepting and quoting these 7 categories, no one at all has followed these 7 categories to the teeth. So let's quickly go through this first category, and then you will be able to understand even more, to become more unveiled how we cannot follow these 7 categories. So in this first category here, you can see that Ibn Hajar is saying, مَتَّفَقَ الشَّيْخَانُ عَلَى تَخْرِيجِهِ. So Ibn Salah rahmallah, he just came up with these categories, and when he mentioned the first category, he said, فَأَوَّلُهَا صَحِيحٌ أَخْرَجَهُ الْبُخَارِ وَمُسْلِمْ جَمِيعًا. That's how he mentioned it. So أَخْرَجَهُ الْبُخَارِ, there's a difference between أَخْرَجَهُ الْبُخَارِ وَمُسْلِمْ and مُتَّفَقَ عَلَيْهِ. And probably you know the difference. The difference is that hadith is only considered muttafaq alayh if the words are similar. So it's not exact, as long as the words are similar, it's not very far off the meaning, and that they are narrated from the same sahabi. So that's the crucial thing. The important thing is that it must be narrated from the same sahabi. You can see here, Ibn Hajar is the one who's putting it, that it must be narrated, because he's saying, ittafaqa shaykhan urfan in this field. As a mustalah, it is used for what Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim narrated from the same sahabi. The way the originator of the person who, the innovator of it, the one who brought it up, Ibn Salah rahmallah mentioned it, he said, أخرجه البخاري ومسلم جميعا. That means if the meaning is the same, but say for example, Imam Bukhari narrated from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, and Imam Muslim rahmallah narrated from Anas radiyallahu anhu, then according to how Ibn Salah mentioned, it would be able to come into the first category. But according to how Ibn Hajar is mentioning, it will not come into the first category. Why? Because it's not narrated from the same sahabi, and therefore it is not muttafaq alayh. So this here is where you can say that Ibn Hajar is further refining the 7 categories, or rather than refining, you can say is elucidating. Maybe you can rather say that Ibn Salah mentioned it vague like this here, but Ibn Hajar is clarifying it, because in his nukat he does clarify it. He mentions there on page 269 that جميع ما قدمنا الكلام عليه من المتفق هو ما اتفقا على تخريجه من حديث صحابي واحد. So in his nukat, that's how he explains the statement of Ibn Salah rahimahullah. Although then after that he does explain that there are different ways of looking at it. He says نعم قد يكون في ذلك الجانب أيضا قوة من جهة أخرى، وهو أن المتن الذي تتعدد طرقه أقوى من المتن الذي ليس له إلا طريق واحدة. Because when you say that Imam Bukhari, and when you say that it's a different sahabi narrating it, what does it mean? It means that there are 2 sources of this hadith. When you are saying there is one sahabi narrating it, it's meaning that it's all coming back to one source. Like Abu Hurairah is the only source of this narration. But when you say that Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu and Anas radiyallahu anhu narrated it, it means now that there are 2 sources. So he's saying that if you look at it from that viewpoint, then it's actually better to say that it's a hadith which is narrated via different sahabis. So now, okay, if you're saying that it's the narrations which are muttafaq alayh, so how many narrations are muttafaq alayh? So yeah, Ibn Hajar in his nukat he quotes Allama Jawzaqi rahmallah, and likewise Allama Sakhawi also quotes in Fath al-Mughith that the muttafaq alayh narrations are 2,326 narrations. That ومما يتعلق بالفائدة التي ذكر الشيخ وهي عدة كتاب مسلم المكرر ما ذكر الجوزقي أيضا في المتفق أن جملة ما اتفق الشيخان على إخراجه من المتون في كتابيهما 2326 حديثا. So this is what Ibn Hajar rahmallah quotes from Allama Jawzaqi. But then there's a kitab which you all probably know it, the kitab which is written Al-Lu'lu' wal-Marjan fi ma ittafaqa alayhi Shaykhan, written by Muhammad Fuad Abdul Baqi. In fact, when starting to memorize hadith, then the first kitab to memorize is Riyadh Salihin, and this is the second kitab to memorize. So because he's gathering the ahadith which are muttafaq alayh, so there he only gathered or he counted them as 2006 narrations. You can see the difference, because obviously it depends, the difference comes about whether you regard a particular narration as muttafaq alayh or not. So Ibn Salah rahmallah and then the commentators who took it from him, and Ibn Hajar rahmallah and then the commentators who are taking this here from him, they are all saying that these 2006 narrations to 2326 narrations, they are the most authentic of all narrations. Then the second is those narrations which only Imam Bukhari rahmallah is narrated, and then as the third category is mentioning that there are those which are which only Imam Muslim rahimullah has narrated. Now moving on, he's going to mention reasons that if you are saying in the first category, it's those narrations which Imam Bukhari rahimullah and Imam Muslim have narrated, then what are the reasons for it? So you can see he's saying لِاتِّفَاقِ الْعُلَمَاء بَعْدَهُمَا عَلَى تَلَقِّي كِتَابَيْهِمَا بِالْقَبُولِ, because scholars have made talaqi, they have accepted their books. So this is the reasoning which he is given. So inshallah in the next lesson we will explain whether this here is a valid reason or not, and the objection which could come about that if there's talaqi bil qabul, then the talaqi for Sahih al-Bukhari and the talaqi for Sahih Muslim are both equal. So then why give preference to Bukhari over Muslim? Inshallah we'll explain all of that on Saturday. Until then, jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What you say, repeat, Stala Qabr al-Wahid, if it's just Abu Huraira and Anas and no other Sahabi, so, because it won't be mutawatir. So you don't, what's the definition of a Qabr al-Wahid? A Qabr al-Wahid, if you remember, we said that you don't look at it at the general, at the lugwi meaning of it. Sheikh Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned earlier that وَكُلُّهَا الْأَقْسَامِ الْأَرْبَعَةِ الْمَذْكُورَةِ سِوَى الْأَوَّلِ وَهُوَ الْمُتَوَاتِرُ آحَادٌ وَيُقَالُ لِكُلِّ مِنْهُمَا خَبْرُ وَاحِدٌ. So Qabr al-Wahid is Aziz Ḥadīth, which is narrated by two different people, by two different asanid. It's also a mashhur narration. So anything which is not mutawatir is Qabr al-Wahid. So according to Muhaddithun, yes, even if Abu Huraira and Anas and another 3-4 additional Sahabas have to narrate it, because it's not mutawatir, it would be Qabr al-Wahid. So I hope that answers your question. So inshallah until Saturday, jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.